The train screeched to a slow halt at the small town station, steam hissing from beneath the wheels. David Hart stood on the platform, duffel bag slung over one shoulder, taking in the familiar landscape. It was supposed to feel like a homecoming, a long-awaited return after nearly 2 years overseas. Instead, he was met with an overwhelming sense of unease. He had written to his wife, Rachel, before his last deployment. They had spoken sparingly, but their last exchange had been hopeful. She had promised to wait for him. Their son, Caleb, had just turned 16. David had imagined this moment countless times, Rachel and Caleb waiting at the train station, eager to embrace him. But no one was there. David frowned as he looked around. The platform was nearly empty except for a few stragglers. No familiar faces. No signs of welcome. His stomach tightened, but he tried to brush off the growing anxiety. Maybe they had gotten the timing wrong. Maybe something had come up last minute. He hailed a cab outside the station, giving the driver the address to the house he and Rachel had bought 10 years ago. As the cab wound through familiar streets, David found himself growing increasingly restless. The town looked the same, but something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it yet, but the nagging sensation in his gut refused to go away. Finally, the cab pulled up to the house, or where the house should have been. David blinked in disbelief. The white 2-story home, with its porch swing and carefully tended garden, was gone. In its place stood a completely renovated building with a "For Sale" sign posted on the front lawn. His heart pounded as he stepped out of the cab, staring at the unfamiliar structure. "This can't be right," he muttered under his breath. He approached the sign, his hands shaking slightly as he traced the bold letters advertising the house for sale. Someone had remodeled the entire property. There were no traces of the life he had left behind. David rang the doorbell, hoping for answers. A man in his late 40s opened the door, dressed casually in a polo shirt and jeans. He looked at David with polite curiosity. "Can I help you?" the man asked. David cleared his throat. "I think there's been some mistake. I'm David Hart. I used to live here with my family. I just got back from deployment, and this used to be my house." The man's expression shifted to one of cautious sympathy. "Oh, I'm sorry, but I bought this house last year. I wasn't aware it belonged to a military family before." "Last year?" David repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "You bought it last year?" The man nodded. "Yeah. The previous owner, Rachel Hart, I think her name was, sold it to me. She said she was relocating. Look, I didn't mean to intrude on your history here, but I had no idea." David barely heard the man's words. His mind reeled as he tried to comprehend what was happening. Rachel had sold the house? Without telling him? Where had she gone? And why hadn't she written to him about any of this? "Do you know where she moved to?" David asked, his voice tight. The man shook his head. "Sorry, I don't. She didn't leave much information. Just signed the paperwork and disappeared, as far as I know." David muttered a quick thanks and stumbled back toward the street. His pulse raced as 1,000 questions flooded his mind. Rachel was gone. The house was gone. And no one had told him. David checked into a cheap motel that evening, unable to shake the growing dread in his chest. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the duffel bag by his feet. The life he had fought to return to was slipping through his fingers. He pulled out his phone and tried calling Rachel's old number. It rang several times before going to voicemail. He left a message, trying to keep his voice calm. "Rachel, it's me. I'm back. I went to the house and it's gone. Please call me. I need to know what's going on." He hung up and leaned back against the headboard, closing his eyes. Exhaustion tugged at him, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept racing with worst-case scenarios. Where was Caleb in all of this? Had Rachel taken him to start a new life with someone else? Was Caleb even safe? The next morning, David began searching for answers. He visited the town records office to confirm the sale of the house. The documents confirmed that Rachel had sold the property almost a year ago. There was no forwarding address listed. He then checked with some of their old neighbors, but most of them had little information. One woman mentioned seeing Rachel with a man around the time she moved, though she didn't know who he was. "Sorry, David," she said kindly. "I wish I could tell you more. I know it's hard coming back to find everything's changed." "Thanks," David replied, forcing a tight smile. Later, David ran into another familiar face, an old high school friend named Peter, who ran a hardware store in town. Peter hesitated before telling David something that made his blood run cold. "I don't know how to say this, man, but I heard your son's been hanging around with a rough crowd lately. A guy named Martin took him under his wing. Not exactly a good influence." David's fists clenched. Caleb was in trouble, and Rachel had vanished without a trace. He had returned from war only to find himself in the middle of a different kind of battle. Whatever was going on, David was going to get to the bottom of it. He wasn't about to lose his family, not without a fight. David couldn't shake Peter's words. His son, Caleb, was hanging around with a dangerous crowd. And this man, Martin, whoever he was, had apparently lured Caleb into some kind of trouble. David's mind was racing with questions. How had things gotten so bad? Why hadn't Rachel reached out to him for help? He couldn't believe that the woman he had loved would just disappear without a word, but then again, the evidence was undeniable. He spent the rest of the day combing through places where Caleb might have been seen, old hangout spots, the school, even the local basketball courts where they used to play when Caleb was younger. No one had seen him lately. It was as though both Rachel and Caleb had vanished into thin air. That evening, David sat in his motel room, scrolling through old photos on his phone. He found one of Rachel, Caleb, and himself from 2 years ago, right before his last deployment. They were smiling by the lake during a family picnic, the sun glinting off the water. It felt like a lifetime ago. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Chris, an old army buddy who had kept tabs on David's family while he was deployed. "Hey man," Chris said after David answered. "I heard you were back. How's everything going?" David hesitated before replying. "Not good, Chris. Rachel sold the house, moved away with Caleb, and I have no idea where they are. Caleb's apparently caught up with some guy named Martin, and no one can tell me anything useful." "Damn," Chris muttered. "That's rough. You want me to ask around? See if anyone knows this Martin guy?" "Yeah," David said. "Anything you can find out. I need to figure out what's going on before it's too late." "Got it. I'll reach out to some people and get back to you." David thanked him and hung up, feeling a small glimmer of hope. If anyone could find leads, it was Chris. He had a way of getting information from people that others couldn't. Still, David couldn't just sit around and wait. He needed to keep digging. The next day, David decided to visit Caleb's old high school. Maybe one of the teachers or administrators had heard something about where Caleb had gone. He walked through the front doors, memories of parent-teacher conferences and school events flashing in his mind. It was strange being here without Rachel or Caleb by his side. He found the school's receptionist, a friendly older woman who recognized him immediately. "David Hart!" she exclaimed with surprise. "I didn't know you were back. How's the family?" David forced a smile. "That's actually why I'm here. I'm trying to find Caleb. I've been overseas, and I just found out he's not living at the old house anymore. Do you know if he's been around?" The receptionist's smile faded. "Oh, Caleb. He hasn't been in school for a while now. I think it's been months. He was a good kid, but he started skipping classes. The last I heard, he fell in with some older boys who weren't exactly a good influence." "Do you know who those boys were?" David asked, trying to keep his frustration in check. "I'm not sure," she said, shaking her head. "But you might want to talk to Mr. Fisher, his old guidance counselor. He was worried about Caleb before he dropped off the radar." David thanked her and made his way to Mr. Fisher's office. The counselor, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a kind demeanor, greeted him with a firm handshake. I wish I had better news for you, David, Fisher said as they sat down. Caleb was struggling last year. It was like he'd lost all his motivation. He started missing school, and when he did show up, he was distant. I tried reaching out to Rachel, but she didn't respond. Did Caleb mention anyone named Martin? David asked. Fisher frowned thoughtfully. I think he might have, once. He said something about a guy who was offering him work, or guidance, I guess. It didn't sound legitimate. I got the impression this Martin guy was some kind of hustler. David's jaw clenched. And no one did anything about it. We didn't have much to go on, Fisher admitted. We can't intervene without proof. Caleb was still under his mother's care, and without her cooperation, we were limited. David nodded grimly. Thanks for your help. As he left the school, a storm of emotions churned inside him. His son had been left vulnerable and manipulated by someone while Rachel had been either absent or complicit. He had trusted her to protect Caleb, and now his son was lost in a world of lies and danger. Later that evening, Chris called back with new information. David, I found something, Chris said. This Martin guy, his full name is Martin Hayes. He's a small-time criminal with a history of running scams and manipulating younger kids to do his dirty work. He's been in and out of trouble for years. Where can I find him? David asked, his voice hard. There's a bar downtown called the Iron Post. Word is, Martin hangs around there with his crew. Be careful, though. He's not the kind of guy you want to corner without backup. I can handle him, David said flatly. Just don't do anything reckless, Chris warned. I know you want answers, but you need to stay smart. I will, David promised. Thanks for the intel. As he ended the call, David's mind sharpened with purpose. He finally had a lead. Martin Hayes was the key to finding out what had happened to his family, and David wasn't going to rest until he got the truth. The battle for his son had begun. The Iron Post was one of those places that hadn't changed in years, a dingy bar tucked between a pawn shop and an abandoned laundromat on the rougher side of town. Its cracked neon sign flickered erratically, casting an eerie red glow on the cracked pavement outside. The place had a reputation for attracting trouble, and tonight was no exception. David pulled into the lot and turned off his engine, sitting in silence for a moment. He was no stranger to hostile environments. He'd walked into worse situations during his deployments. But this was different. This wasn't about war or survival. This was about his son. He stepped out of the car, adjusting the collar of his jacket as he surveyed the scene. A few rough-looking men loitered near the entrance, smoking and eyeing him warily. David ignored them, pushing open the heavy metal door and stepping inside. The bar was dimly lit, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the stench of stale beer. A jukebox in the corner played an old blues song, its mournful notes barely audible over the low murmur of conversation. David scanned the room, looking for any sign of Martin Hayes. He didn't know exactly what the man looked like, but he had a feeling he would know when he saw him. He walked to the bar and ordered a soda, keeping his eyes on the crowd. The bartender, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, gave him a curious glance as he handed over the drink. You new around here? The bartender asked. Just passing through, David replied. Looking for someone. Yeah? Who? Martin Hayes, David said evenly. I heard he might be around. The bartender's expression darkened slightly. What do you want with Martin? David didn't flinch. Just a conversation. The bartender studied him for a moment before jerking his head toward the back of the bar. He's in the corner booth. But watch yourself. Martin doesn't like surprises. David followed the bartender's gaze and spotted a man sitting in the shadows near the back wall. He had a lean, wiry frame and sharp features, his eyes constantly scanning the room like a predator sizing up prey. Two younger men sat with him, laughing at something he had said, but Martin's smile didn't reach his eyes. David clenched his jaw and made his way across the room. The conversations around him seemed to quiet as he passed, curious eyes following his every move. When he reached the booth, Martin looked up, his gaze narrowing as he took in David's presence. "Can I help you?" Martin asked, his tone casual but wary. "You're Martin Hayes," David said, more of a statement than a question. Martin leaned back in his seat, smirking. "That's right. And who the hell are you?" "David Hart," he replied. "I'm Caleb's father." For the first time, a flicker of recognition crossed Martin's face. His smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Ah. Caleb. Haven't seen him in a while. What brings you here, David?" "I want answers," David said bluntly. "I want to know what you've been telling my son. What kind of work you've been dragging him into." Martin chuckled softly. "You've got it all wrong, man. Caleb came to me. He was lost, looking for direction. I just gave him opportunities." "Opportunities," David repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "Is that what you call manipulating teenagers into running scams for you?" Martin's eyes hardened. "Watch your tone, soldier boy. You don't know me, and you don't know how things work around here." "I know enough," David said, leaning forward slightly. "I know that you saw a kid who was struggling and took advantage of him. And now you're going to tell me exactly where he is." The tension between them crackled like static electricity. Martin's two companions shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how far this confrontation was going to go. For a moment, David thought Martin might try to brush him off or escalate the situation into violence. But Martin surprised him. He held up his hands in mock surrender. "Relax. I don't want any trouble. Last I heard, Caleb was staying with some friends a few blocks from here. He's not working for me anymore. He's got his own thing going now." "Where?" David demanded. Martin rattled off an address without hesitation. "There. Now we're square, right?" David glared at him for a long moment before stepping back. "If I find out you've been near my son again, you'll wish I'd stayed overseas." Martin's smirk returned, but it was tinged with unease. "Noted. Good luck, Hart." David turned and walked away, his mind racing. He had a lead now, but there were still too many questions. Why had Caleb turned to someone like Martin in the first place? And what had driven Rachel to abandon their home and leave Caleb in this mess? As he stepped outside into the cool night air, David knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. He wasn't just fighting to bring his family back together, he was fighting to save his son from a life that could destroy him. David drove through the desolate streets on the edge of town, the address Martin had given him scrawled on a slip of paper in the passenger seat. The houses here were run down, and weathered by time, their lawns overgrown and fences sagging under the weight of neglect. This was not the kind of place he ever imagined Caleb would end up. His headlights swept across the street signs as he searched for the right house. Finally, he spotted it, a single-story structure with peeling paint and a broken porch light. A few cars were parked haphazardly in the driveway and along the curb, and faint music drifted from inside. David killed the engine and stepped out of the car. He approached the house cautiously, his senses on high alert. The house exuded an air of decay and danger. He could hear voices now, young men laughing and shouting over the music. It sounded like a group of teenagers, maybe a little older than Caleb. He knocked firmly on the door, and the sound echoed through the house. The laughter inside abruptly died down, replaced by hushed murmurs. After a few moments, the door opened a crack, and a tall, wiry teenager peered out at him with suspicion. "Yeah? What do you want?" the boy asked. "I'm looking for Caleb Hart," David said, his tone steady but authoritative. "I was told he might be staying here." The boy frowned and hesitated. "Caleb? I don't know, man. Maybe you've got the wrong place." David took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Don't lie to me. If Caleb's here, I need to see him. Now." The boy opened the door a bit wider, clearly intimidated by David's presence. "All right, chill. I think he's in the back room. Just wait here." David didn't wait. He pushed the door open fully and stepped inside, ignoring the protests from the boy. The living room was a mess, empty pizza boxes, beer cans, and ashtrays littered the coffee table. A few other teenagers were sprawled on a worn-out couch, staring at David with wide eyes. They looked more like lost kids than hardened criminals, but he knew how quickly bad influences could change that. "Where's Caleb?" David demanded, his gaze sweeping the room. "Back there," one of the teens mumbled, pointing toward a hallway. David strode down the hall, his boots thudding heavily on the worn floorboards. He reached the last door on the right and knocked once before pushing it open. Inside, he found Caleb sitting on a mattress on the floor, scrolling through his phone. His son looked up in shock, his eyes widening as he recognized David. "Dad?" Caleb's voice was a mixture of surprise and fear. "What are you doing here?" "I should be asking you the same thing," David replied, his voice tight with anger and concern. "Why the hell are you staying in a place like this?" Caleb stood up quickly, stuffing his phone into his pocket. It's not what you think. I just needed a place to crash for a while. It's temporary." "Temporary?" David repeated incredulously. "You're living in a dump surrounded by kids who are going down a bad road. Do you have any idea how dangerous this is?" Caleb crossed his arms defensively. "You don't understand. You've been gone, Dad. You don't know what's been going on." "Then explain it to me," David demanded. "Tell me why your mother sold the house and disappeared. Tell me why you ended up in a place like this, working for a guy like Martin Hayes." Caleb flinched at the mention of Martin's name. "I wasn't working for him," he muttered. "Not really. He gave me some things to do. He said it would help me make money." "Make money for what?" David pressed. "What could you possibly need from someone like him?" Caleb hesitated, guilt flashing across his face. "After Mom moved out, everything went to shit. I didn't have anywhere to go. Martin offered me a way out." David's heart sank. He had known things were bad, but hearing it from his son made it all the more real. Rachel had left Caleb vulnerable, and predators like Martin had swooped in to exploit that vulnerability. "I'm here now," David said, his voice softening. "You don't have to do this anymore. We're going to fix this. But you have to trust me, Caleb." Caleb stared at him for a long moment, the walls of defiance slowly crumbling. Finally, he nodded. Okay. I'll come with you." David breathed a sigh of relief. "Good. Let's get out of here." As they left the house, David could feel the eyes of the other teens following them. He ignored the stares and led Caleb to the car. Once they were inside, he turned to his son. "Do you know where your mother is?" he asked. Caleb shook his head. "She left about a year ago. I haven't seen her since. She said she needed time to figure things out." David clenched the steering wheel tightly. "She abandoned you, Caleb. She should have called me. I would have come back." "I don't think she wanted you to," Caleb said quietly. "She seemed different. Like she was running from something." David's mind raced with possibilities. What could Rachel have been running from? And why had she left Caleb behind to fend for himself? One thing was clear, the mystery of Rachel's disappearance was far from solved. But at least he had his son back. That was a start. "We'll figure this out," David said firmly. "Together." Caleb nodded, a glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. For the first time in months, he didn't feel so alone. David drove Caleb back to the motel in silence. His mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, relief that he had found his son, rage at Rachel's betrayal, and confusion over the secrets she had been hiding. Caleb, meanwhile, sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring out the window as if lost in his own thoughts. When they arrived, David unlocked the door and gestured for Caleb to come inside. The room was small and plain, but it was clean and safe. Caleb dropped his backpack on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, looking awkward and unsure of what to say. "You hungry?" David asked after a moment. "Yeah," Caleb replied softly. David ordered some takeout from a nearby diner, then pulled up a chair across from his son. He needed to understand what had happened during the time he was away. "Start from the beginning," David said gently. What happened after I left for deployment? Why did your mom sell the house? Caleb hesitated, fidgeting with the hem of his sweatshirt. Things were okay at first, he began. But then, Mom started acting weird. She'd get really stressed out and wouldn't tell me why. She kept saying she was trying to protect us. Protect you from what? David asked. I don't know, Caleb admitted. She wouldn't say. But then she sold the house, and we moved around for a while. It felt like she was running from something, but I didn't understand what. David leaned forward, his jaw tightening. Did she ever mention anyone? Someone she might have been afraid of? No, Caleb said, shaking his head. But there was this one time. I remember her getting a phone call. She looked scared after that. She told me to pack a bag because we were leaving the next day. After that, we ended up in some crappy apartment in another town. David's mind raced. Who had called Rachel? And what could have scared her enough to uproot their entire life? Do you think she was in trouble? David asked. Maybe, Caleb said quietly. But she never told me anything. Eventually, she just left. I came home one day, and she was gone. She left a note saying she needed time and that she'd come back when she could. David exhaled slowly, trying to process the information. Rachel had been running from something, or someone. But why hadn't she reached out to him for help? Why had she left Caleb behind? Do you still have the note? David asked. Yeah, I think so, Caleb replied, digging through his backpack. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and handed it to David. David unfolded the note and read the hastily scrawled message. Caleb, I'm sorry. I have to go for a while. This is for your own safety. Please stay strong. I'll come back when it's safe. It wasn't much, but it confirmed what David had suspected. Rachel had been afraid for her life and possibly for Caleb's. But why? And who had made her feel so threatened? I'll get to the bottom of this, David promised, folding the note and tucking it into his pocket. No one is going to hurt our family again. The takeout arrived shortly afterward, and the two of them ate quietly. Caleb seemed more relaxed now, though he still carried an air of uncertainty. David knew it would take time to rebuild their relationship, but he was determined to be the father Caleb needed. So, what happens now? Caleb asked between bites of his burger. First, we're going to get you somewhere safe, David said. I don't trust that Martin guy or the people he's been hanging around with. Then I'm going to figure out where your mom went. Caleb hesitated before asking. Do you think she's okay? I don't know, David admitted. But we're going to find out. Together. Caleb nodded, seeming reassured by his father's determination. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the world alone. The next morning, David received a call from Chris. I did some digging, Chris said. I found something that might be connected to Rachel. There's a guy named Vincent Reese, small-time loan shark, but dangerous. He's been known to harass people who owe him money or cross him in some way. Vincent Reese, David repeated, committing the name to memory. You think Rachel had a run-in with him? Could be, Chris replied. He operates in a few towns around here, including this one. If Rachel got involved with him somehow, it might explain why she was running. David clenched his jaw. If this Vincent Reese had been threatening Rachel, it meant his family had been in danger the entire time he was overseas. Where can I find him? David asked. He's got a few businesses as fronts, Chris said. There's a pawn shop called Reese's Deals on the east side of town. That might be a good place to start. Thanks, Chris. I owe you one. Just be careful, Chris warned. Guys like Vincent don't play around. David hung up and turned to Caleb, who had been listening quietly. I've got a lead, David said. Stay here and lay low. I'll check it out. Be careful, Dad, Caleb said, worry flashing in his eyes. I will, David promised. With a renewed sense of purpose, David grabbed his jacket and headed out. He was finally closing in on the truth, and he wouldn't stop until he had answers. Whoever Vincent Reese was, he had a lot to answer for. The pawn shop known as Reese's Deals was a rundown establishment on the east side of town, blending in seamlessly with the surrounding decay. Its grimy windows displayed an assortment of outdated electronics, tarnished jewelry, and worn-out tools, all of which had likely seen better days decades ago. The sign above the door was faded, with only a few of the letters still legible. David pulled up to the curb and sat in his car for a moment, sizing up the place. He knew from experience that businesses like this were often fronts for illegal activities. If Vincent Reese was as dangerous as Chris had warned, David needed to tread carefully. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and made his way inside. A bell jingled as David pushed open the door. The smell of dust and mildew hit him immediately. The interior was cluttered and dimly lit, with glass display cases lining the walls. Behind one of the counters stood a burly man with a bald head and a face that looked like it had been in one too many bar fights. He glanced up as David entered, his expression one of mild disinterest. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice gruff. "I'm looking for Vincent Reese," David said calmly, stepping up to the counter. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who's asking?" "David Hart. I need to talk to him about Rachel Hart." At the mention of Rachel's name, the man's demeanor changed. His posture stiffened, and he gave David a hard, appraising look. "Never heard of her," he said flatly. "Don't lie to me," David said, his voice low and dangerous. "I know he's been involved with her. I'm not leaving until I get some answers." The man crossed his arms and smirked. "You think you can just walk in here and demand information? You've got guts, I'll give you that." David took a step closer, his eyes cold and unyielding. "I've seen men like you before. You think you can intimidate me? Try again. I've been through hell, and I'm not afraid of you or your boss. Now, are you going to take me to Vincent, or do I have to find him myself?" The man's smirk faltered. He seemed to weigh his options before finally sighing. "Fine. Wait here." He disappeared through a door at the back of the shop, leaving David alone. The seconds ticked by slowly, each one stretching the tension in the air. David's fists clenched at his sides as he mentally prepared himself for whatever confrontation lay ahead. A few minutes later, the man returned and gestured for David to follow him. They passed through the door into a narrow hallway that led to a small office at the back of the building. Inside, a man in his late 40s sat behind a cluttered desk. He had a sharp, angular face, slick back hair, and a calculating gaze that immediately put David on edge. "Vincent Reese, I presume," David said as he stepped inside. Vincent leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "And you must be David Hart. I've heard a little about you." "Then you know why I'm here," David replied. "I want to know what you did to Rachel." Vincent chuckled softly. "What I did? You've got it all wrong, Mr. Hart. Rachel came to me. She needed help, and I provided it." "Help?" David echoed, his voice laced with disbelief. "You mean you took advantage of her?" Now, Vincent said with a mockingly innocent tone. "Business is business. Rachel had debts. I offered her a way to pay them off." "What kind of debts?" David demanded. Vincent shrugged. "Personal matters. Let's just say she found herself in a tight spot and needed a loan. Things didn't exactly work out in her favor." David's blood boiled. "So you threatened her? Forced her to sell the house and disappear?" "I didn't force her to do anything," Vincent replied smoothly. "She made her own choices. I simply reminded her of the consequences if she didn't honor our agreement." David took a menacing step forward, his fists clenched. "You tore my family apart. You put my son in danger. You think I'm going to let you walk away from that?" Vincent's guards moved to intervene, but Vincent held up a hand, stopping them. He stood slowly, meeting David's glare with one of his own. "Careful, Mr. Hart," Vincent said, his tone cold. "You're not overseas anymore. There are rules here, consequences for stepping out of line." David didn't back down. "I don't care about your rules," I'm not afraid of you. For a moment, the two men stood locked in a silent standoff. Finally, Vincent smiled thinly. You've got fire. I respect that. But you're out of your depth. Rachel's gone, and as far as I'm concerned, your business with me is over. We'll see about that, David said through gritted teeth. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office, his mind racing with fury and determination. He had learned one thing for certain: Vincent Reese had played a major role in Rachel's disappearance. But there were still too many unanswered questions. He needed to find Rachel and uncover the full truth. Back at the motel, Caleb was waiting anxiously. He sat up straight when David walked through the door. Did you find anything? Caleb asked. Yeah, David said, his voice tense. There's a man named Vincent Reese who's been causing a lot of trouble for your mom. He's the reason she was running. Caleb's eyes widened. What are we going to do? We're going to find your mom, David said firmly. And when we do, we'll make sure Reese never threatens our family again. Caleb nodded, his trust in his father growing stronger by the minute. Together, they would face whatever came next. David wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot. David was done chasing shadows. Vincent Reese might have held some of the answers, but he wasn't going to get anything more from the pawn shop kingpin without pushing things to a dangerous level. Instead, David decided to focus on another lead, finding out where Rachel might have fled after selling the house. The man at the center of it all was a known manipulator, and David knew Vincent wouldn't just let a debtor like Rachel disappear without a way to find her. There was a system to predators like Vincent. Rachel had run from him once. David suspected that, somewhere along the line, she might have reached out to someone for help or left clues behind without even realizing it. David and Caleb sat together in the motel room, poring over a stack of papers and phone records that Chris had managed to dig up through his connections. Most of the documents were mundane: legal records of the house sale, public listings tied to Rachel's name, but one stood out: a lease agreement for a short-term apartment rental in a neighboring town about 8 months ago. It wasn't much, but it was the first real lead they'd found in days. This is it, David said, circling the address on the paper. It's the only place listed under her name since she left. We need to check it out. Do you think she's still there? Caleb asked. Maybe, maybe not, David replied honestly. But it's the best lead we've got. Even if she's moved on, someone there might know where she went. Caleb nodded silently. He had been quieter since learning about Vincent, but David could see the worry etched on his face. His son had been through more than any teenager should, and the weight of their broken family was pressing down on him. David placed a reassuring hand on Caleb's shoulder. We'll get through this. I promise. Caleb met his eyes and gave a small nod. Okay, Dad. Let's go. The drive to the neighboring town was uneventful, but the tension in the air was palpable. They arrived at the apartment complex just after noon. It was a drab, low-rise building with peeling paint and rusted railings. The kind of place people went when they had nowhere else to turn. David parked the car and scanned the area. A few tenants were coming and going, but none of them seemed to pay much attention to the newcomers. David approached the building manager's office, Caleb close behind him. A tired-looking woman with graying hair sat behind a cluttered desk, flipping through a stack of papers. Excuse me, David said politely. I'm looking for someone who might have lived here a few months ago, Rachel Hart. I believe she rented an apartment in this building. The woman raised an eyebrow and sighed. I don't usually give out information about tenants. I understand, David said, pulling out his military ID. I'm her husband, and this is our son. We're trying to find her. She's been missing for a while. The woman's expression softened slightly. You military folks get yourselves into all kinds of trouble, huh? She stood and grabbed a large logbook from a nearby shelf. Let's see. Rachel Hart, you said? David nodded. The woman flipped through the pages, stopping when she found the entry. Yeah, she rented apartment 3B for about 5 months. Paid cash. Didn't leave a forwarding address when she moved out, though. Do you remember anything about her? David asked. Did she say where she was going or mention anyone she might have been in contact with? The woman shook her head. Not much, I'm afraid. She kept to herself mostly. Real quiet. But… She hesitated, then glanced over at Caleb. She did have a visitor once. A man. He wasn't from around here, looked like trouble. David's jaw tightened. Do you remember what he looked like? Tall, dark hair, fancy suit. I got the feeling he wasn't here for friendly reasons, if you catch my drift. Vincent Reese, David muttered under his breath. The woman frowned. Don't know his name. But he wasn't someone you'd want to cross. David thanked her and turned to Caleb. Let's check the apartment. Maybe there's something she left behind. Apartment 3B was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. The door was locked, but David managed to persuade the building manager to let them in, explaining the situation further. The apartment was empty and stripped bare, but there were still faint traces of Rachel's presence. Scuff marks on the floor where furniture had once been, a forgotten curtain rod hanging loosely in the window frame. David and Caleb split up to search the apartment. Caleb rifled through the kitchen cabinets and closets, while David inspected the living room and bedroom. After a few minutes, Caleb called out, Dad! I found something! David hurried to the kitchen, where Caleb was holding a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was wedged behind a drawer that had been stuck in place. David took the paper and unfolded it carefully. It was another note, written in Rachel's handwriting. Vincent knows. No place is safe anymore. I have to disappear. If anyone finds this, tell Caleb I love him. David's heart sank. Rachel had been on the run from Vincent for longer than he had realized. She had truly believed she was out of options. We're close, Caleb, David said softly. She was here not too long ago. We'll find her. Caleb nodded, his eyes misty. I hope so. David folded the note and placed it in his pocket. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but they weren't finished yet. Vincent Reese held more power over their lives than David had anticipated, and he wasn't going to let that stand. David paced in the motel room, his mind racing with possibilities. Rachel had been on the run, hunted by Vincent Reese for reasons he still didn't fully understand. The note Caleb had found only confirmed that she was terrified enough to abandon her own son. Yet, despite everything, she had left breadcrumbs, hints of where she had been and what she feared. Dad, Caleb said softly from the bed, watching his father pace. What if we're too late? What if something's happened to her? David stopped in his tracks and turned to his son. He could see the fear in Caleb's eyes, the fear that Rachel might already be gone. David wouldn't allow that thought to take root. He had to stay strong for both of them. We're not too late, David said firmly. She's still out there. And we're going to find her. The sound of his phone vibrating broke the tense silence. David quickly picked it up and saw that Chris was calling. Chris, David answered. Tell me you've got something. I might, Chris said, his tone cautious. Remember how I told you that Vincent uses multiple fronts for his business? Well, I heard from a contact that he's been operating out of a warehouse on the outskirts of town. It's where he handles his more sensitive matters. Sensitive matters, David repeated grimly. You mean the people he intimidates and threatens? Exactly, Chris confirmed. If Rachel had any remaining ties to him, there's a chance he might know more than he's letting on. You'll need to be careful, though. This isn't just a pawn shop. He'll have muscle there. David clenched his jaw. I'll handle it. David, just remember, this isn't a battlefield. Don't do anything that'll make things worse. I know what I'm doing, David said, his voice steely. Thanks for the tip. He ended the call and turned to Caleb. We've got a lead. I need you to stay here while I check it out. Caleb stood up, shaking his head. No. I want to come with you. It's too dangerous, David said firmly. If things go south, I need to know you're safe. But she's my mom, Caleb argued. I can't just sit here and do nothing. David sighed, understanding his son's frustration. He placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. I know how much you want to help. But the best way you can do that right now is by staying out of harm's way. I'll bring her back, I promise. After a long moment, Caleb reluctantly nodded. Okay. But you better come back too. I will, David assured him. The warehouse was located in an industrial area on the outskirts of town. It was a large, imposing structure surrounded by chain-link fencing. Dim security lights cast long shadows across the cracked pavement. David parked his car a few blocks away and approached on foot, keeping to the shadows as he assessed the area. 2 guards stood near the entrance, both armed and alert. David's military instincts kicked in as he quickly formulated a plan. He couldn't risk a full-blown confrontation, not with Rachel's safety potentially on the line. He needed to create a distraction. David circled around the building, finding a side entrance that was less guarded. He picked up a rusted metal pipe from the ground and threw it across the yard, aiming for a stack of crates near the perimeter. The loud clatter echoed through the night, drawing the guards' attention. Did you hear that? One of the guards muttered. Yeah. Let's check it out, the other replied. They moved toward the sound, leaving the main entrance momentarily unguarded. David seized the opportunity, slipping through the side door and into the warehouse. The interior was dimly lit and eerily quiet, the air heavy with the scent of motor oil and dust. Rows of crates and machinery created a labyrinthine layout that made it easy to stay hidden. As he navigated the space, David heard voices echoing from further inside. He moved closer, keeping to the shadows. He could make out Vincent Reese's voice, calm, calculating, and filled with the kind of arrogance that came from years of getting away with intimidation. Rachel's long gone, Vincent was saying. She's smart enough to know that running was her only option. But even the smartest people slip up eventually. David's blood boiled. Vincent knew more than he had let on. Rachel had been on the run for months, but Vincent seemed confident that he could find her again if he wanted to. David crept closer, peering around a stack of crates. Vincent stood near a makeshift office area with 2 of his men flanking him. They were discussing their operations like it was just another business transaction. I don't care about her, Vincent continued. What I care about is making sure no one else thinks they can cross me. If she resurfaces, I want to know immediately. David gritted his teeth. He couldn't wait any longer. He stepped out of the shadows and leveled a cold glare at Vincent. She's not going to resurface, David said, his voice cutting through the room. Because I'm going to make sure you never get near her again. The room fell silent as Vincent and his men turned to face him. For a moment, Vincent looked genuinely surprised. Then his expression hardened. Well, Vincent said, his tone mocking. David Hart. You've got guts, I'll give you that. This ends now, David said, stepping closer. You've terrorized my family long enough. You're going to tell me everything you know about where Rachel might have gone, or you're going to regret it. Vincent chuckled, shaking his head. You think you can just walk in here and make demands? You're in over your head, soldier boy. David took another step forward, his eyes cold and unwavering. Try me. The tension in the room was electric, both sides waiting to see who would make the first move. David was ready for whatever came next. He wasn't leaving without answers. The warehouse grew deathly quiet. Vincent Reese's mocking smile faded as he studied David with narrowed eyes. His guards shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they should intervene. Vincent raised a hand to keep them back, his expression darkening with cold amusement. You've got guts, Vincent said softly. But you're out of your element. I don't play games, Hart. You're walking into something you don't understand. David's eyes remained locked on Vincent. What I understand is that you used my wife. You made her life hell and left my son to fend for himself. You pushed her to run, and now I'm here to make sure you don't hurt her, or anyone else, again. Vincent chuckled, shaking his head. Is that so? And what exactly are you going to do about it? David stepped forward, the tension crackling like static in the air. You tell me where Rachel is, or I'll make sure you never have another peaceful day in your life. One of the guards, clearly feeling the tension, pulled a switchblade from his pocket and took a step forward. "I think you need to leave before things get ugly," he growled. "Stand down," Vincent said quietly, holding up a hand. He eyed David, his amusement giving way to something colder. "You've got fire, I'll give you that. But you should understand something. Rachel's fate was sealed the moment she came to me. People who cross me don't get second chances." David's blood boiled, but he kept his composure. He knew men like Vincent thrived on fear and intimidation. Losing control would only give Vincent the upper hand. Instead, David focused on his training, years of survival instincts sharpened by war. He was no stranger to dealing with dangerous men. "I don't care about your threats," David said coldly. "You might scare other people, but not me. You're going to talk, Reese. You're going to tell me everything." For a moment, Vincent said nothing. The air grew heavier, as though everyone was waiting for the explosion. Then Vincent sighed, almost as if he were bored. "Fine," Vincent said. "You want the truth? Rachel came to me because she thought she could protect you and your son from a problem she created. She owed money to the wrong people. I bought out her debt and gave her a way out. But when she couldn't keep up her end of the deal, she ran. That's not my fault, Hart. That's on her." David's fists clenched. "And you just let her disappear?" Vincent shrugged. "She's been off the grid for a while. She's not my problem anymore. But if you think I'm going to let you walk out of here with nothing but your righteous anger, you're mistaken. Then let me make it clear," David growled. "If you come near my family again, I'll make you wish you never laid eyes on us." Vincent's cold eyes bore into David for a long moment. Finally, he smirked. "You've got a lot of nerve, Hart. I can respect that. But this is the last warning you'll get." David didn't respond. He turned on his heel and walked out, his boots echoing ominously in the silence. The guards exchanged uncertain glances, but no one dared follow him. Outside, David exhaled slowly, the cool night air washing over him. He had gotten what he needed, confirmation that Rachel had fled to protect him and Caleb from a debt she couldn't repay. Vincent wasn't actively hunting her anymore, but she was still out there somewhere, living in fear. David knew the battle wasn't over. But at least now he had leverage. Vincent wouldn't risk going after them again, not after tonight's confrontation. Still, David couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper had been at play, something Rachel hadn't told him. Back at the motel, Caleb jumped to his feet as soon as David walked in. "Did you find out anything?" Caleb asked, his eyes filled with hope and fear. David nodded and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Your mom ran to protect us. She was trying to shield you from the people she owed. Vincent isn't after her anymore, but she's still out there somewhere. We'll find her." Caleb swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he said, "I just want her to come home." "She will," David promised. "But it's going to take time. We have to be patient." Caleb nodded, wiping his eyes. For the first time since David had returned, there was a sense of relief in the air. The nightmare they had been living through was beginning to lift, though the scars would remain. In the following weeks, David worked tirelessly to rebuild his family's life. He kept searching for leads on Rachel, reaching out to old contacts, and gathering every scrap of information he could find. Slowly but surely, he pieced together a trail, one that led to a small town a few states away. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope. Caleb began attending school again, and the weight of the past slowly began to ease. The bond between father and son grew stronger with each passing day. They were healing, but David knew they wouldn't truly be whole until Rachel was back with them. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their temporary home, Caleb turned to David and said, "Thanks for not giving up on us." David smiled, the warmth of his son's words filling the void that had been left by months of pain. "I'll never give up on you, Caleb. We're a family. And families stick together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, David knew that the fight wasn't over. But he was ready for whatever came next. He had faced war, betrayal, and danger, and he had come out stronger on the other side. The search for Rachel would continue. And no matter how long it took, David would bring his family back together.